Hi, I'm Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Abstract Essay, where ideas take shape, thoughts find depth, and every conversation explores the art of thinking beyond the obvious. And today I have my special guest. She's the author of the book Modern Motherhood, no other than Miss Jodi Vandenberg-Daves.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me. I appreciate
Well,
it.
welcome, Miss Jodi. And as usual, can you please introduce more about yourself that I miss?
Yeah, sure. I am fundamentally, I think, an educator and mentor and writer at heart. And I spent a lot of my career in higher education doing all those things. And now I kind of move in some different spaces where I am a leadership strategist and coach. So it kind of brings in the same kinds of things. And my work is really about empowering inclusive leaders at every level. And, as referenced here with my previous book about motherhood, I also bring in, the empowering people who are caregivers in the workplace. So I feel like you don't need a title to be a leader. I know you don't need a title to be a leader. Leadership is really expansive, and I want to especially help courageous leaders in the workplace that we really need today, people who are justice minded. I want to help leaders, especially diverse women I often work with, who have so many leadership skills that I want to help them name and claim and level up, because we need things like advocacy and team building and thought leadership and innovation around creating inclusive spaces and building bridges. And so I'm trying to unleash a lot of beautiful life affirming work in the world and help people live their dreams in the workplace. And I have a vision too of workplaces that are more inclusive and creative and even positive civic spaces in our world. So, and then my writing really connects to that with my forthcoming book. And I love to write about lots of different things, but this has been a book in the making for a long time. That's called Leading with Courage, a career-long guide for idealistic women. And it's about a whole career journey arc of using your voice and becoming an empowered, inclusive leader.
Miss Jodi Vandenberg-Daves. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. And today, let's talk about your mother or your modern motherhood. What has sparked the initial idea of modern motherhood? And when did you realize this needed to be a book?
Yes, thank you. I became a mother a number of years ago. I won't even say how many. And at the time, I was a trained historian and I was teaching history, and I realized that there wasn't enough out there to really understand the experience that I and so many other mothers were having in a historical frame. And so I taught for many years. I taught a history of motherhood, and there weren't that many courses taught about that at that time. And eventually I decided this needs to be a book, because there was no book that was really just an overview synthesis. You can read it in one book, kind of an overview of the history of motherhood. And so I decided we needed one. And that's how that came about. And it was truly a labor of love that I think, again, about lifting up unsung work. The work of caring for our children and caring for others has been historically assigned to women, but we haven't always had the best working conditions around that and policies and things like that. So it takes on a lot of topics that I think a lot of people can relate to.
Miss Jody, if you compare your modern motherhood to your upcoming book leadership, what the big difference?
So the focus is quite different in that the first was truly historical and really focused on mothers and motherhood in American history. The second one is research-based self-help. So it is actually kind of in the more the business self-help genre, but it takes all my sort of women's studies knowledge and I always have my historian hat on too. And it's really more of a mentoring document for people, like a mentoring guide. And so it's much more about the workplace. It's hard to divorce all the things I do together. So again, I have a pretty robust chapter on work life issues for mothers and caregivers. But I also, and I weave that throughout, but I also see this as um, a really different kind of read, something I hope people will pass around and go, I got some ideas for that. Let's talk about how we can make our workplace better. Let's talk about how we can empower women leaders. Let's talk about how we can create conversations across generations so that we can make sure that lots of different voices are being heard. So it's really a different kind of focus. It's way less scholarly. I think it's an easier read too.
Easier read for
Yeah.
sure. Miss Jody, if you want to help a modern motherhood in the 21st century, which aspect you want to help them?
Oh, there are so many. I really feel like better public policy is some of the most important. That's one of the most important pieces, and that includes, we're one of the few countries in the world that doesn't have paid family leave. We don't have a very robust equal pay situation. We don't do enough to really help with work-life balance, and so I think public policy can really help us with a lot of those things. Um, and I think making that work more visible, caregiving work, and making it more shared, making it less privatized and focused on women. Even though we have people of all genders who do caregiving, we still have a lot of cultural baggage around, the idea that women will be responsible for a lot of that. So we need to share that life affirming work, and we need to support that work culturally, but also again through our policies that we make, our public policies, and I would add our workplace policies as well.
Workplace policy. Indeed. Were there any surprising discoveries in early research that reshape the book's direction? Modern motherhood.
Oh, modern motherhood. Um, yes, I would say the difficulty finding mothers' voices um, in the sea of source material that sort of gets close to motherhood but doesn't actually find their voices. We have a culture that doesn't make a lot of room for mothers' voices, and so finding that and lifting up what I knew was true, like kind of reading between the lines, but lifting up resilience, resourcefulness, and sort of even the strategic thinking of motherhood took a lot of work. I had to get beyond sort of the sources by the medical establishment and the social workers and the cultural commentators to find material that was in mothers' voices. And so just the ways in which women's voices still are silenced as mothers in a lot of ways. And then I think I would add just how little control women have had over their bodies historically. Because there's so many individual studies, and we know, so much good research about just like the history of, um, abortion rights and things like that. But when you start to bring it, through a couple centuries, a few centuries, you realize, wow, it's so unusual for women to have rights to their bodies in the world. And we're still struggling so much to keep the remnants of what feminists have really worked to create in that area.
Definitely. And Miss Jody, let's talk about the research and sourcing of the book itself. What type of sources were most valuable, and where did you uncover hidden gems?
Yeah, a lot of the work, again, I'm synthesizing the work of many other scholars too. So there's not as much primary research, but I did some research in popular culture, in magazines. I think there are hidden gems in the oral histories that other people have done that I've been able to kind of weave together as well. The diary evidence, there you have to work and poke into the little rabbit holes to find some things about the history of motherhood. So I think even just engaging the readers with where are the sources was part of the richness of that book. I mentioned on your other podcast how like some historians have looked at sources around nursing and the use of breast milk for medicine, or in recipe books. The fact that advice to mothers was sometimes found in cookbooks and just
Yes.
strange places, and also like digging into oral history and involving my students in that when I was still in the classroom, like, where did your mother get her advice? And what are some things that happened to your mother that you might not have known about? And just really, we have so much in our own family history. So by the time the book came out, I was also trying to empower people to raise those questions with their mothers, to ask their mothers about their stories as mothers. And that's a rich experience.
Interesting indeed. Miss Jodi, so did you encounter conflicting historical narratives about motherhood?
Conflicting historical narratives. Yeah, I think in some ways we always do, because when we research gender and other systems of oppression, on the one hand, we have so much evidence, it's so clear how the deck is stacked against mothers, particularly mothers who lacked privilege on the basis of their economic status, their race, their immigration status, not being married, lots of ways in which mothers lacked privilege. And on the other hand, the ways in which being a mother was so often so central to women's identities, and that there are ways in which women can make an empowerment out of that, can find empowering identities even as mothers, even in the midst of lots of systems of oppression, if that makes sense.
Makes sense, Miss Jodi. And let's talk about the structural challenges of the book itself. How did you organize such a vast timeline between the 19th century to present? Did you consider a thematic versus chronological approach?
Yes, I got myself really caught up in a thematic approach for a brief time at the beginning of the writing, because there are so many fascinating themes you could pull out. And I happened to meet with an editor. It's not the press I ended up publishing with, but I met with an editor who said, "Why don't you just use chronology? Isn't that how you teach the course?" And so I said, "You know what? Light bulb.
Yes,
Yes, you're right." Yes, it actually goes back to the 17th century, briefly. But I did the organizing feature that I found helpful was, what does it mean to make motherhood modern? How does the medical establishment come into that? How does industrialization come into that? How does psychology come into that? How does mass advertising come into that? How does, division of labor in the home and motherhood ideals come into that? So I did a brief. I decided to be very brief on the period that I don't know as much about, just in terms of my own training, the colonial period. I just was brief on that. And I kind of just dove into that to say, here are the basic things that are different and similar to what's going to come next. And then I think I tried to also just like use the historical research we have and put and center mothers. So I guess that's part of how I organized it. And yeah, and some of the periodization too was around, like, when do we get these very sentimentalized, flowery ideas of mothers as these sort of like the Marmee and Little Women, basically. I mean, that is the mid 19th century. And so unpacking that ideal helped me think about how I could move that forward, move that analysis forward in the 20th century as well.
Miss Jody, which chapter or sections was the most difficult to structure and why?
The most difficult to structure was the one about that brings in issues around the emergence of public policy and what historians call the social welfare state in the late 19th and early 20th century. And part of the reason there is, in my training as a historian, that is like the burned over district. So many really powerful historians have covered that period, including historians of women. And I found it hard to find my voice and my place in that space. And the material is really hard to interpret and explain, which is to say, there are all kinds of helping things that are done for mothers in that period. We get like mothers' pensions and the beginning of organized childcare and children's health initiatives and maternal health initiatives, and the Children's Bureau is formed on the one hand. On the other hand, there can be a lot of coercive things for mothers. The boarding school movement was emerging, and the kind of cultural imperialism around with some of the social workers who went to the homes of immigrants. And so it's like all this kind of like, you have this on the one hand and you have that on the other hand. And again, for me, it was also a little bit of intimidation on like, wow, these are the big leaders in my field, and I'm trying to say something valuable here about motherhood. So that was definitely the hardest to write.
Interesting, Miss Jodi. So, how do you decide whose voice to center?
Mm.
Were there marginalized perspectives or thought to include?
Marginalized perspectives wherever I can. That's part of how we understand the systems in our society and what needs to change, is by looking at who has not been served and whose stories and voices have not been heard. And I just have a lifelong commitment to that. And so, yeah, but you also have to go where the sources are. So you have to go where the sources are and read between the lines. Who has access to literacy? Even in the letters written to the U.S. Children's Bureau are some of the best sources I used ever in my class and love working with in my book. And they're from about 1915 to 1929 or something like that. And a lot of those women were barely literate. They could barely spell. They had probably written very few letters in their lives. And it makes you think about who had access to literacy, even in a time period when we think more people would, in the United States. And so there's always a way in which we can't capture everyone's story, and it's a kind of a life's work for many historians who are justice minded to keep figuring out how to dig into those little spaces to enlarge what we know about people's whose stories that have been silenced and people who face the most oppressive circumstances.
Miss Jodi, let's talk about the writing process. What did your daily writing routine look like, and how did you maintain momentum?
So when I was writing the Modern Motherhood book, I had a sabbatical, and that was a wonderful thing for part of it. And I also took some part-time, even at I like went part-time for a while to finish this. This was a really major project. My writing routine during the sabbatical was dropping off kids at school, buying myself the New York Times and Junior Mints on my way home at the gas station, and then sitting down and working on that thing as long as I could make it work. And then I would cram in times in the afternoon where it would be revision. My brain works best in the morning, revision or tying up little knots and things like that. When I went back into the classroom, I tried to carve out Friday mornings, and I'm still tired. So it's things like Friday morning, you will revise chapter 6, you will do it, And so I would have very clear sort of tasks for myself, and I would usually get them done because I was pretty disciplined at the time. And something about being a working mother and having a big teaching load, and it made me do it, and I think there's also like let's get this done at some point too.
Let's do it. Stop procrastinating.
Exactly.
And how do you make dense historical analysis to feel personal and relatable?
Oh, what a lovely question. I love your questions. Yeah, that wherever I can, I use voice. I put it in quotations. I give it credit. I use the voices of women who lived in history. So if I had to dig for them, but that's how it becomes personal and relatable. And it's something I always told my students to do in their writing too, like bring out people's voices. Don't put people on the other end of passive verbs. Bring out their voices.
Yes. Bring their voices, people. And were there moments when you felt overwhelmed by the material?
Yes, so many, so many. I think particularly that 1890 to 1920 period, that trying to find my way through the alleys of that period, I often did feel overwhelmed. I felt more There came to be a point in the writing, though, later in the writing, when I felt less overwhelmed because I thought, I've gotten this far. I think the readers are with me. And I think I'm at this point saying some things that are pretty original. And so I started to kind of buoy myself again with the last bits of it.
Mm, interesting. Miss Jody, and let's talk about editing and refinement. What
Mm.
feedback from early readers changed the book significantly?
Well, I mentioned the feedback from that editor that was really important. And then there was also a moment when I was in a little creative group. It wasn't about writing per se, but somebody told me how he talked about like throwing out the first draft of something. And that was really powerful for me to realize I don't have to write like I'm a historian of colonial America. I can just make that short. I threw out the first draft of what I did for that whole part of the book so that I could really get in and develop the momentum. And then as far as feedback along the way, I'm a big fan of writing groups. We had at my university, we had what was called the History Author Working Group. And we were on deck, every month somebody different would be sharing a piece of their work in progress. And we would be hopefully kind critics and instigators. And I don't remember a particular piece of feedback that was super important, except a few moments when I thought, oh, learning how to take feedback as a writer is also about knowing, well, that's interesting to them, but it's not where I'm going. And so sometimes the feedback was actually more like, that's really interesting feedback, but it actually fortifies me to go, but that's what they're interested in. This is the book that I'm writing. That said, I used feedback, no question. And I don't remember the details, but like people were so kind to read what I was writing and share their thoughts. And that
Yes,
was incredibly valuable.
that's amazing for sure. Did you cut any fascinating stories or chapters that did not make the final draft?
Oh, that's a good question, but I'm not sure I fully know how to answer that at this point. Except to say, because it's been a while since I wrote that book, except to say, it would be amazing to have more oral histories in that book that I learned about over and over again from having my students do oral histories. I mean, just off the top of my head, I think about like more than one student telling me, and this was quite a number of years ago, but telling me that like, oh, my mom would nurse me and my cousin, and then my aunt would nurse my cousin and me. Like, oh, okay, so there's a whole history of breastfeeding that nobody's written about. Like just those oral history pieces are gems, and we need more of those. We need a lot more research on this and a lot more writing.
Hmm, definitely. And how do you handle the tension between academic and accessibility for general audience?
Um, I think it was trying to make sure that I got some feedback from people who were not PhD historians and that I just tried. One of my students once told me, who read my work, you write the way you talk. And I love to hear that because I feel like I'm kind of comfortable in a descriptive voice. And so I tried to write the way I talk. I know I didn't do it as well as I wanted to, in part because you are navigating the conventions of your field. And this is a peer reviewed by other historians, by Rutgers University Press, so I really tried to straddle that line. But I also tried to just be a little less wordy. And one of the things that I did over and over again was shorten my sentences because my first drafts are way too long.
So let's talk about the personal connections, Miss Jody.
Mhm.
Was there a historical mother story that resonated with you deeply?
Oh, a story that resonated with me deeply. I think so many of the women's stories where in the 20th century you start to see women saying, where is myself in all of this? Like, where is that self? Did I lose it? And how can I do this well and never quite feeling like you're doing it well enough. And I think the culture of expertise that we got in the 20th century and all the kind of fire hose of information often made us as mothers feel insecure. And I felt some relief knowing it wasn't just me, feeling like I was never sure that I was doing the right thing to have my kids turn out right. I always like that big picture perspective where I can step back and go, well, this is a little bit socially constructed for me. Like there's a whole bunch of experts or would be experts competing for my attention to tell me how I might do it wrong. There's a whole bunch of mother blame in the culture that could make me feel bad. And so seeing how women experience that in history was powerful. And some women who dealt with things that I just beyond ever going to be my experience. I think about like women who were labeled refrigerator mothers because of their children's autism, and their children were taken away and put in institutions, and not nice not very helpful institutions. I'm putting that very mildly. The women were told it was their fault, and so just such a wide range of experience that I think just brings some of the pathos of the experiences of motherhood.
Miss Jodi, did writing this book change how you view your own mother or motherhood journey?
One of the things I loved about this book, where I really saw my own mother in history, was that piece about resourcefulness and resilience. My mom would save every coupon, and she would shop at different grocery stores, and she would just make things work. And I found that that's so often the work of mothering. Resources might be scarce at different times, and mothers are problem solvers, and they're scrappy, and they make things work. And I think the ability to take pride in that was amplified by not just the book, but by all the teaching I did about it. And so I think I take pride in my own resilience and resourcefulness as a mother, and have some self-compassion for some of the challenges of that journey, because I have a pretty deep and wide knowledge now about these experiences.
How did you separate your emotional reactions to the material from the historical analysis?
That's an interesting question. Um, I mean, it helps sometimes that these are long ago experiences and I can intellectualize. I think I intellectualize a little bit. But I don't always separate myself either. I mean, I try to put my heart into my writing. And I was just mentioning the other day that for a while I also taught I guess I only did it one time. I taught a history of childhood class. And it just broke my heart too much. Kids have been so disempowered throughout history. I just couldn't do it. Um, Maybe the fact that I'm writing about adults who still, many of them had so little agency, like enslaved people, for example, heartbreaking stuff. But somehow maybe it was a little easier writing about adults than kids. I don't know. It's hard. It's a hard question to answer. I'm not sure I'm doing it well.
So let's talk about the legacy and impact, Miss Jodi. What do you hope readers take away about how motherhood has or has not changed?
The has not changed is laying so much of the world's challenges at the feet of mothers and asking them to do the work with so few resources and so little understanding, and so much gender oppression and other kinds of oppression. What has changed? Many things. I mean, women can have more voice in politics and therefore more voice in their world. Women are can have more labor market kind of leverage, and have, because of feminist activism, moved into lots of different kinds of jobs. And I think that there is less than we had in the 1980s, say, less freak out about working mothers, and more understanding and even admiration for that work. There's been a lot of changes in the last 10 or 20 years that in terms of economic inequality and a fraying, fractured social safety net, and state violence towards many women and mothers, that is also making things harder. So it's like And then I would add one more just because to add a positive change. There's more awareness of the diversity of mothers and the experience of mothering, and that part is positive.
Miss Jodi, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, people. My other podcast, because my abstract essay is already in fifth season, abstract poetry in second season, and my book 101 review in fifth season too. Comedy 101 in second season, and my food 101 in fifth season as well. Geography 101 in fourth season, and my baby podcast, Law 101 and Mental Health 101. Love Letters in its third season, and Movie 101 Review and Music 101 in fourth season, and Science 101 and Sex 101 in its first season. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. So, Miss Jodi, if you could write a sequel exploring one unanswered question, what would it be?
A sequel exploring one unanswered question. I think if we could get at more sources about women's feelings about motherhood over the course of their lives, I would love to see that. Much of the research on much of the source material on the history of motherhood is really about raising young children, but motherhood is often lifelong. So I'd love to see more on that.
Yes, indeed. And Miss Jodi, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. So can you please invite our listeners to support your book as well as your upcoming book, Leadership?
Yeah. So you can find my work at JodiVandenberg-Daves.com. I have an upcoming Perfectionism and Imposter Syndrome webinar on August 19th. You're welcome to tune in. It's a free webinar. And I have an upcoming cohort of a class called Unlocking Your Leadership Potential, which is a women's leadership intensive. So if you're interested in some of what I talked about the book at the beginning, check out my website. It's all there, and I'd love to connect with more of your listeners.
Yes, people, let's support Ms. Jodi Vandenberg-Daves, because if you support her, for sure, more and more and more empowering books to come, more and more empowering advocacy to come. So, Ms. Jodi, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
More to come, people. See you soon.